long do you worry about your digestive symptoms each day? And how long do your elaborate routines that keep you safe take you? If you're afraid to go out without sitting on the toilet 5 times or getting up at 5 a.m. in order to create enough time for your morning routine, then this episode could be for you. Today, I'm going to be talking about anticipatory anxiety and the things that you might be doing to keep yourself feeling safe. I work with a lot of people who have frequent loose stools, and this kind of anxiety about what if I can't find a toilet? What if I have an accident? Is so common. In this episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS, I'm going to share some practical strategies that I help people to manage this exact fear. Hello and welcome to episode 99 of the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. I'm Anna Mapson. This week's episode is going to be about the types of activities that you carry out before you feel like you can leave the house, or the very elaborate routines that you have to do before you go to the toilet every day. I work with people who have loose stools and frequent diarrhea, and also people who have constipation and hard stools that take a long time to pass. So for both these groups of people, there is a time spent on the toilet, and sometimes a lot of things that people need to do in order to get that bowel movement out and feel like they're in a place where they can leave the house. This can really eat into your personal time. It can leave you feeling like your digestion is taking over your life, that you are restricting your free time because you're spending so much time on the toilet. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different clients throughout this episode who have all had various kinds of routines and things, and trying to give you some practical tips that you can put into practice in your own life if you recognise yourself in this. So first of all, one of the things you might like to do is to look at a pattern in your digestive symptoms. One of the best ways to do this is to start tracking your symptoms, and I'll put in the show notes a link to my tracker where you can download a free guide or spreadsheet that I have, which shows you exactly what to track and how to do it. And you can also listen to episode 6 where I go through all the details about how to do this. That's a good place to start because it helps you to identify patterns in your bowel movements. Now, if you are creating a lot of routine around going to the toilet, sometimes you won't necessarily see these patterns in their natural state because you're kind of forcing your body to go. Now, if you think about why it is you're doing this in the first place, it's to avoid the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario for you might be if you've got diarrhea, that you suddenly need it, you're in a park and you have to go to the toilet and there's nowhere around and you have an accident. That is going to be the worst case scenario for many people. The other side of that of constipation is either that you suddenly need the toilet and then you get to a toilet and you have to sit there for ages and people are waiting and perhaps it's very uncomfortable, or people may be able to hear you. So those two worst case scenarios are definitely things that I have worked with my client base. A couple of the examples of the routines that I'm actually talking about would include things like getting up at 4:30 in the morning so that you can go to the toilet multiple times before you need to leave the house. I have had clients who do this. Somebody I worked with was getting up at 4:30 so they could go to the toilet twice, or I think 3 times, and they would try and push this through by having a coffee, having a cigarette. These are both stimulants and will help you go normally. And then they were able to leave the house. Other people I've worked with will sit on the toilet and try and force a bowel movement out in the afternoon because they felt like they needed to have an extra bowel movement in the day. So their routine was to sit there for over half an hour, even if they didn't feel an urge, because then they would feel like they were able to enjoy their dinner more because they were less bloated and less full. Another example of someone I've worked with was somebody who would sit on the toilet for up to an hour because they were worried about having diarrhea out of the house and had had some really bad experiences. And so before leaving the house would need to sit on the toilet for up to an hour. So these are examples of the kind of things that people put into practice. And the problem with that is the time that it takes up. So for the person who was getting up really early, for example, they were losing out on their sleep. For the person who needed to sit on the toilet because they're waiting for something to happen before they can leave the house, even if you don't need to go, they were wasting that time when they could have been doing something else. So it's time, but also psychologically, what it does is it puts in place these kind of practices that you feel that you have to do. And if you don't do them, something bad will happen. It's avoidant behaviors, because what you're avoiding is going out and seeing what happens. The more you do these long, repetitive processes, the more your mind feels like you have to do them, and it becomes ingrained in you that you don't feel safe to leave the house without those processes. It can kind of make the worst case scenario feel more scary because you're not encountering it, and because you are putting in these things that keep you safe, but they're actually not allowing you to experience times when it can go well as well. So you're always thinking about the times it might go wrong. So the thoughts that you're having about those worst case scenario examples, needing the toilet and being desperate to go, or having to go in a public place, or feeling like you can't go and holding it in, those instances are often, in the experience of people I've worked with, few and far between, but the impact of those has been so great. So it may have only happened a handful of times, but it has become a really bad experience that you do not want to relive. And I completely understand that. You want to stay safe and not experience things that were traumatic, horrible, painful, uncomfortable, and embarrassing. Why would we want to do those? I'm not saying that we should be going through those experiences, but more that you are not allowing yourself to see times when it doesn't happen that way and it can actually be okay. So when we have those anxiety-driven thoughts, one way to try and challenge them is to actually get some data on how often they're happening. So, for example, if you do leave the house without going to the toilet, what would actually happen? One of those reasons I suggested tracking your symptoms is so that you can try and get some actual data on what has happened and what happens to you when you are living life a little bit more normally. So how often has it actually happened to you that you've had that bad experience? Out of all the times you've been to the toilet, how many times has it been that bad? What actually happens the majority of times? And then also it might be worth thinking about, okay, if that did happen, how can you cope with it? What are the resources that you need to enable you to be able to cope with it? For example, if you feel like you need the toilet when you're out, what kind of things could you do, and what kind of warning might you get that you might need the toilet, and how can you try to get more comfortable? There's a technique from CBT which might also be quite helpful here, which is using a ladder of things that you are worried about to rank from something small that you potentially could cope with, and then ranging up to like your biggest fear. So for example, if you feel like you have to go to the toilet 3 times before you leave the house every time, what would be possible for you to do without going to the toilet 3 times? So could you walk to the end of the road? And depending on how long your road is, that could be a big challenge, or it could be not a big challenge. Can you just walk to the corner and back again without going to the toilet 3 times? Maybe that's near the bottom of your ladder. But perhaps going for a drive in the car and then going for a walk in the countryside and then driving home when there's no toilets around, that would be like at the top of the ladder, because you're doing some activity, you're in the car, you're going somewhere where there's no known toilets. Like that could be top of your worries. Or perhaps going to sit in a cinema, something like that you might be very scared of. So every person will have a different ladder of the things that they feel, that's probably doable. Maybe I can manage that, to, oh my God, that is just way beyond what I feel I could cope with. actually just writing it all down in ladder form, in stages, so that you can start at the bottom and then work upwards. The other thing you can do is to think about the avoidant behaviours and how you can reduce them a little bit. So if you have to go to the toilet 3 times before you leave the house, could you just try twice? And then keep that as your new baseline, your new normal. What happens if you only go twice and you try twice and then you go about your normal day? How much difference does it make? Or perhaps it's the amount of time that you sit on the toilet for. So if you're somebody who normally sits there for half an hour, can you try bringing that down to 20 minutes? In this way, what you're doing is you're setting yourself small, manageable targets that you can work towards, rather than just leaping into completely getting rid of these behaviours and going out and just living normally. That might feel a bit too scary. So it's really helpful to have these staged approaches that you can manage it in a way that feels doable for you. There's no point someone saying, just don't do it. I've tried that with my clients and it doesn't work. You have to understand how to get from one place to the next. Otherwise, you would have done it. If you're somebody who has these elaborate routines, that logically it may not be helping, but it's a psychological safety mechanism for you. And you need to work out the easiest way to transition out of that behavior. So a lot of people I work with will know that it's probably not a helpful behavior, but they're still finding it really hard to let go of. And so just putting in place these small steps, either reducing the behavior that you don't find helpful until you are able to live more normally, or increasing the things that you can do without the behavior. And this way, we're just really gradually working up to stopping it, because it's interfering with your life, and it can be something that is holding you back and holding you in the place where IBS is controlling your life. The other thing that's good to do in these situations is to think about the physical sensations. So there's 2 opposite extreme ends. Some people I work with are so overly attuned to every tiny gurgle, noise, feeling inside their gut, and that immediately sparks anxiety. Every time they feel a bubble of gas or they have a twinge about maybe I need the toilet, that can set them into a kind of fight or flight mechanism where they're really running on high stress state, feeling very anxious, and immediately that then causes them to need the toilet. So overly sensitive around digestion. Then at the other end, the extreme, there are people I work with who have minimized their digestive symptoms so much they don't want to hear about it, that they don't feel any hunger. They don't really notice how they're feeling in their stomach. So if either of those things may relate to you, what I would suggest is trying to work on what is a sensation of your physical digestion, what is an emotion. For example, that feeling we get when we do feel very nervous and we feel a bit scared, that can also feel like digestive symptoms. Like maybe you feel a little bit sick when you feel nervous, or you feel unsettled and a bit queasy. Maybe that gurgling in your stomach is actually down to how you're feeling anxious. So sometimes there can be a bit of a mix-up in our feelings. The other thing is maybe more likely with people who have minimized their digestive symptoms, that they will experience maybe low mood. There's something called alexithymia as well, which means that you don't recognize your feelings. So you may have physical sensations of an emotion, but you don't recognize that as an emotion. It's a kind of psychological term. But it's interesting that sometimes it plays out in the way our digestive system is not getting the blame for the symptoms, but you're actually experiencing an emotion, but putting all the blame onto digestion. So sometimes it's helpful to be more cognizant in a very calm way about how we're feeling. The things that you could do to help with that is to write down how you're feeling, or try and record how you're actually feeling. What are the physical sensations that you're feeling at those moments when you start to think about your digestion, or you start to think about going out without the protective behaviours. So that is about understanding your emotions and your physical sensations, and sometimes maybe get them confused, and if you do, just trying to draw that apart. That is not an easy process to do, and it definitely takes a lot of work and can take a lot of time. So it's not a quick fix, but something to maybe bear in mind. It may have some bearing on how you're feeling. The other thing we can do as well is, when you're noticing different sensations, is to think about how much you can tolerate them. So this is probably more likely to come for those people who have diarrhea and loose stools and the crampy sensations, rather than people who have constipation, because they don't get these symptoms as much. So if you have the urge to go to the toilet very frequently, can you rate how bad the urge is, how strong it is? You might remember that I mentioned this in episode 93 when I talked about my case study. This person had very frequent urges to go to the toilet, and the way we worked on it was looking at whether it was always a real urge or just a sensation. Because if you are going multiple times to the toilet, it doesn't always mean that there are multiple poos waiting to come out. Sometimes you're just feeling an urge inside. And so learning to rate and rank these urges, and then which ones kind of get stronger and mean that you have to go to the toilet, is really helpful, because it helps you understand whether those sensations were a real urge to go to the toilet, and it's helping you learn your own body a bit better, helping you learn your own sensations. There is so much that you could say about this topic, but I hope that it has given you a few ideas and things to think about in terms of reducing your reliance on these behaviours that perhaps you know are not particularly helpful, but are nevertheless the things that you have to do in order to leave the house, or to go to the gym, or get to work, or whatever it is. Everybody I work with has different situation, and hopefully some of these will be relevant to you. If you've enjoyed this episode, or you have got anything from it, please will you give me a rating on the podcast app that you're listening on. All you have to do is go and click rate, or rate this show, and tell me what you thought about it. I'd love to hear from you. Also, if you have questions about anything to do with IBS or SIBO, gut health, any of the symptoms that I normally talk about, really happy to run different episodes based on the questions that I get from people. It's always really nice to hear from you. So please do send me a line. All right, I'm going to have to leave it there for today, but thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Inside Knowledge. Better digestion for everyone.